So we are live at Kigali, and we have two important guests who will demystify the crisis communications that was all over the place during the pandemic. And they represent also two geographies which are of extreme interest to the Kigali Global Dialogue, one from South Africa and the other from Rwanda. So without much ado, let me turn on my right to Nyokori Odes, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Umuganda, Rwanda. Nice alliteration. And there is Henriette Esterhuisen, who is Senior Advisor in the Association of Progressive Communications in South Africa. So welcome.
Thank you.
Now, without much ado, would you, Odes, tell me about your organization first and the kind of extent of crisis that you had to face in the Rwandan communication landscape?
Yeah, so I'll start by introducing myself again. I'm Odas. I'm from a company called Digital Umuganda, and part of our mission is to democratize access to information and services in local African languages. And the rationale behind that is that, internet is heavily skewed towards English, almost 50%, when only 5% speaks English natively. So you can understand, even with the reach of information on the internet, there's still a huge part of the population that doesn't have access to information. And during COVID, that's where we looked at and said, how do we ensure that everybody has access to information by making information in local languages and through channels that people have access to? So in a nutshell, that's how we met crisis communication.
Right. So I will turn to Annette, but I must say that these days it's not about just the language English or otherwise, it's also video, which is a language unto itself in disinformation. But would you like to say a few opening words on your organization and the extent of crisis and communication crisis that you faced?
Thanks. Yes. So APC is a global network of civil society organizations working on communication and information for social justice, environmental justice, and human rights. I think for us, the big crisis was actually created not so much by misinformation, but by how governments tended to respond to misinformation. So legislation was created, passed quickly in many African countries to criminalize misinformation, when in fact those resources and energies should have gone into better information, more information. And I think, Odes, your point is we had that in South Africa as well. You can't just use the digital sphere. It seems easy to reach people. It's easy for governments and public health authorities to put information online. It does not necessarily get to the target
Would you
audiences.
not call it one of two steps? One could be criminalizing and to ensure that there is a huge disincentive against folks who make a killing out of revenue models and the likes economy and the shares economy. And on the other hand, increase information base. Would it be an either or otherwise?
I think it is an either or. I think if you criminalize individual actions in terms of spreading bad information without targeting those business models that monetize extremism and that monetize information that is disinformation, for example, anti-vaccine myths, you're not going to reach a target. So I think it's far better then to look at the business models, to look at regulating those business models, and to use global fora to deal with companies like Facebook and Twitter, because their business models, particularly Facebook's business model really, they might have taken action against vaccine-related misinformation, but they took their time before.
But since you mentioned Facebook, I won't pass the baton right away, but still persist with you. They also own WhatsApp. And I suppose in every region of the planet, WhatsApp is nearly impossible to track. The coding is pretty much within the secret domain. And therefore, if criminal action to some initiator is not taken by some codes that the polices across the planet have also developed, what else can governments do?
I think I'm not saying that there aren't cases where action is not justified, but I think what governments really can do is to build trust, to communicate effectively, to use the medium and the language that's going to reach the target audience, and to counter bad information with better information. And to ensure that they are trusted, I think. And then the other thing, I think, to deal with your WhatsApp issue, we need every internet user, every person, every child needs to understand that misinformation is part of our reality. And critical thinking, I think, has always been a useful skill. It was a useful skill 100 years ago. I think it's now an essential skill. Teaching ourselves, our children, our communities to not take every bit of information for granted.
Sure. The binary
And to
approach.
think.
Now, coming to how governments itself can be also part of the misinformation, how there is an axe to grind sometimes, and therefore, who stops that?
I think it should be a collective effort, but I think it should be led by the government to ensure that information, there's a trusted source of information, first of all. Take the COVID case. If there's no trusted source of information, then information can be fabricated and passed through the WhatsApp messages and WhatsApp stories that you were talking about. And there's this thing called African ant messages. So it's basically those myth or misinformation that's passed on through groups and through messages on WhatsApp. So I think the first step is to create trusted sources of information. And second is to ensure that everybody has access to it. So it's not just somebody who has access to the internet, because that's 20% of the population. So you need to ensure that 80%, the other 80% get access to that information, and it's in the local languages. And that people also, as you were saying, build trust. So if this is done on a persistent time of period, then people start, seeing, if it's from here, then it's a trusted information.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But you know what? One of the things about the internet and sharing economy or likes economy is that not everyone wants to be responsible knowingly. They are happy to forward things saying, I don't know the facts, but I'm forwarding it nonetheless. So where does the regulation then play out when there is a crisis on hand and all kinds of information are floating? Even trusted sources are becoming, unless you have proper newsrooms and video editors and senior officials who are willing to stick their neck out by name, the trusted also are subject to question.
I think yes, but I think you have to have the trusted public sources of information. Then, yes, you should be able to take action. I think there needs to be accountability. I think we have lessons for accountable journalism, responsible media that have existed in the offline world, which we can apply to the online world. I think we don't need to necessarily criminalize individual expression, but we can encourage more accountability and demand that social media platforms adhere to those levels of accountability. And I think individuals should also be able to hold accountable. And I think you can do that through, in fact, we just had there was a massive ruling in the US last week where Alex Jones, a radio source of misinformation, had to pay, I think, more than $50 million in damages as a result of saying that a school shooting incident was fabricated by the parents. So I think we need to have recourse. But I think if we start with criminalizing expression, criminalizing disinformation, we're taking state and public expenditure away from where it really should be, which is in trusted information that reaches people where they really need to be reached.
Right. So illustratively, what were the examples of crisis communications which Rwanda faced and then handled well or not so well, perhaps, on hindsight?
So I'll basically, since it's just a post-pandemic era, I'll talk about the COVID era. So when COVID started in Rwanda, it started more by air travelers. So a lot of people in the rural areas felt, this is not something of a concern. It's not only going to affect a certain class in urban areas. But when it started getting to everyone, then no one was safe until everyone was safe. That they knew how to prevent themselves, they knew the symptoms. And information at first was passed through Twitter. And internet connectivity in Rwanda is around 20%. So you can understand that 80% of the population doesn't have access to this information. So you have to use channels that people have access to, which is radio, which is a simple USSD format. So basically you dial star something and you get information. And that's one of the things that helped a lot. And the other thing is to ensure that not only people have the information, but also have the services at the local level, and to decentralize this information, which means that I shouldn't need a lot to counter misinformation. So if I have a trusted source of information, right on my fingertips, then I don't need basically to call someone who's going to check for me on the internet.
Got it.
Yeah.
South Africa?
Well, there was a case actually during the pandemic where someone who was actively spreading misinformation about the pandemic was taken to the Human Rights Commission for spreading harmful content and was fined as a result of that. So I think there are ways of dealing with individual cases of bad information. But I think you also need to recognize that social media was also a source of countering misinformation. I think that's the other thing you need to be very careful about, because once you start targeting individual expression, even in WhatsApp, you could also be blocking counter-information. And I think counter-information, particularly if it uses trusted sources, can actually be very powerful. But I have one story from South Africa which relates to what you are saying, which is that once vaccines were available, you needed to register online for your appointment. And uptake was extremely low. Why? Because people don't have access, or they don't have data. And even if they know that there are these public services available, it's not easy for them to do that because of affordability. Many don't have smartphones. And I think that's an example where after the government had put effective measures into place, very smooth vaccination procedure, low uptake because the communication strategy did not reach people in the way that it needed to reach them.
Excellent. Thank you. This was a very constructive dialogue on how trust and trust alone is the way forward. Of course, there are some bad apples that need to be mercilessly pulled out, but as was pointed out, it should be done in a more discerning manner than sometimes governments do. And they did, perhaps because of the extent of pressure on them at that time. Having said that, I think I feel very fortunate as an Indian because as a matter of abundant disclaimer, I work for Reliance Industries, which has Jio, 450 million mobile phones, about 12 gigabytes of data every month being consumed per capita. So I think proliferation of good messaging, responsible and trusted messaging was not quite the problem here. And I think the ubiquity of the smartphone also helped. We hope that there'll be more such examples across the planet in Rwanda, South Africa, and the entire planet on how human beings can get more connected through the instrument of change, which is this, and not necessarily the word of mouth, which sometimes this itself can spread. So thank you very much for joining Kigali Global Dialogue.